Okay, so I think we're ready to start. So again, my name is Adrienne Eaton. I'm the Dean of the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University. Oh, thank you. We are speaking from the Beyster Symposium Conference of the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at the Rutgers University School of Management and Labor Relations. The theme of this conference is Employees Share Ownership and Modest Income Employees. And the conference is taking place in La Jolla, California, which everybody in this room knows, but our viewers may not. So I want to just say I feel like we're off to a fantastic start. I hope that you all agree. The sessions so far have been really interesting. My welcome this morning was extremely brief under instructions from Joseph, but I want to say that similar is the School of Management and Labor Relations is very pleased to be hosting what is the 10th Beyster Symposium, and I'm not sure people are aware that that's a big kind of anniversary date. So this session is going to be dealing with a body of work by Corey Rosen. And what I'm going to do is introduce Corey, and then there will be two discussants after Corey's presentation, and then a series of brief comments, as Joseph has labeled them. So what I'm going to do is introduce Corey and the two discussants, and then when they're done, I will introduce separately the brief commenters. So again, first up is Corey Rosen discussing 40 years of employee ownership research and experience, I think, in practice. Corey is the founder, as many of you will know, and senior staff member of the National Center for Employee Ownership. And then as discussants, we will have Eric Olson and Camille Kerr.
And I wanted to get into playing the game. I was teaching political science, and so I applied for a congressional fellowship and got that and went to work on Capitol Hill. And after a couple of years, I ended up working for the Senate Small Business Committee, and I read this article by William White. Some of you may know who William White was, William Foote White, famous sociologist. He was once the president of the American Sociological Association. And it was an article about this idea of employee ownership. And I thought, this is really interesting, because the only thing that really moved me in terms of work and career was fighting for some cause. I was pretty convinced after a couple years on Capitol Hill and having studied Congress for years before that, that if you wanted to create a way to broaden the distribution of wealth or income, and you wanted to find some way that employees could be treated with more dignity and respect at work, that mandating these things wasn't going to get you anywhere, and that redistributing wealth in large measure through the tax system was a dead end. Because regardless of your ideological proclivities about whether that's a good idea or not, the only practical political way to do that was that everything you did to redistribute wealth to the most needy people had to be redistributed in multiples to people who were less needy. And that's how all the entitlements programs work. The difficulty with that is that if you do that, the costs are going to be so tremendous that it's not going to be politically and maybe economically sustainable. So here was this idea that instead of trying to move these ideas forward based on altruism, moved it forward based on self-interest. That employee ownership was an idea that owners of companies could say, well, gee, it's really in my interest because of these tax incentives and because maybe people will be better employees to promote this idea of employee ownership. And if you could tie this social justice idea to people's self-interest, you really had something. So I decided I got to be involved in this. So I got involved in drafting some legislation, the most notable of which was what is now Section 1042 of the tax code, which is the provision that allows sellers to an ESOP to defer capital gains tax. And I convinced my bosses to introduce that, and eventually it became law. So in 1980, I was thinking, well, what's the next step? I thought, well, this is such a great idea, convinced me, that we just needed to go out and convince other people, and it would be just a little bit more difficult, but you know, we could do that. I could do that, I thought presumptuously. And so I decided to start the National Center for Employee Ownership. Lacking a garage, alas, I had to go down to my basement and declare that the National Center for Employee Ownership. And today we have 14 staff people. Lauren Rogers is our terrific executive director for the last several years. We have about a $2.7 million budget. We had 1,820 people at our most recent conference. So the organization, I'm pleased to say, has grown, and it's been a lot of fun. So, oops, I was off on that. 2.6, it's 2.7. So one of the driving forces behind the NCO was we needed to do two critical research things. The first was, does it work for companies? Because if it doesn't work for companies, then nobody's going to do it. And secondly, does it work for employees? Because if it doesn't work for employees, there's no point in doing it. And so we needed to do objective research on this. We also needed to know what makes employee ownership work better or worse. And in 1980, I had written a report for the Senate Small Business Committee in which I remember the famous words that the overwhelming preponderance of evidence supported that employee ownership was successful. And that was true, except there are only 2 studies, both of which were positive. So we really needed something a lot better than that to be persuasive. And it's those issues that have primarily driven the research efforts both of myself and the NCO over the last now 38 years. I've done some of that research, but most of the research that I'll be talking about was done in conjunction with other people, and eventually my role in research diminished, and we have other people who do that research on staff. You heard, of course, from one of them, Nancy Wiefek, this morning, who we are most fortunate to have with us. So the first question was, if employee ownership is going to affect the performance of companies, we need to know, presumably, if it affects the attitudes and behavior of employees. Because if it's going to improve corporate performance, that's the mechanism by which it's going to do it. So we needed to find an answer to whether employee ownership changed people's attitudes and behavior, and if so, why? And if it did change people's attitudes and behavior, did that have a consequence in terms of corporate performance? Because while it might seem logically that one would follow the other, it's not necessarily true. You could have more motivated employees who were interested in how well the stock did and who were contributing ideas about how the company could perform better, but that doesn't mean that those ideas would be useful or that motivation would translate into more dollars. So while those questions seem related, they're only, they're not determinative of one another. So to answer that question, we decided that we'd do a big national survey of ESOP companies, primarily ESOP companies. There were a few others. And I was very fortunate that one day I got a call from a young woman named Catherine Klein, who was getting her PhD dissertation at the University of Texas and was also interested in employee ownership. And she had some hypotheses that she wanted to test, but she didn't have a database. Well, we had created a way to gather these data, which would take a long time, and we really needed someone who could help us to do that work and to analyze it, and also to help make sure that the questions that we were asking were the right ones. I had some experience with designing survey data, and I'd done a fair amount of research on the organizational behavior, and we had some hypotheses that needed to be refined. But fortunately, we were able to hire Catherine, and that turned out to be a terrific partnership. As some of you may know, Catherine has gone on to a sparkling academic career. She's a really leading figure in organizational development, and the research she did for us won multiple awards, deservedly. So we were very, very lucky. We've been really lucky, actually, all along with the staff people we've hired. So we looked for the traditional sorts of things: job satisfaction, turnover, motivation, feeling of being listened to. And there were a number of hypotheses that seemed logical and that a lot of people were proposing about what is it that would make employees feel more or less like an owner, that would make them more satisfied with work, that would make them more motivated, that would make them less likely to leave, all the outcomes that we'd like to see. So I see I have a typo there. I apologize for that. Those of you who know me really well will recognize that typos are a hallmark characteristic of anything that I do. Camille is laughing. She used to work with us, and Lauren's laughing. You know this. Anyway, you can look at all those hypotheses, take a look at those. Imagine that you are back in the early 1980s, and I just want you to think to yourself, which of those things would matter? So how many people think seniority would be related to your attitudes towards being an owner? Seniority? Industry, would industry matter? Majority employee owned or not, would that be a factor? Quite a few people. Voting rights, how about voting? Lots of people say voting rights. Education of the employee. Job position, you know, whether you're a manager or not. Unionization. Voting rights I have twice, it was so important. Company size, so big versus small. Age of the plan, and the change in the stock price. And the answer is, and that was one of the things that Catherine won the awards for, was particularly on demographics, which you'd think, well, more educated, more professional employees would relate to being employee owners more because they'd understand it more, they would get more through these ESOPs, they would be better able to relate what they did to stock price, and none of that was true when you held constant for these three things. The size of the annual contribution, we did complicated path analyses. This was much harder, by the way, when we did it, because all the papers, all the surveys were on paper, and they actually had to be entered into very primitive computers. This was a whole lot more difficult in those days. But what we found was the size of the annual contribution was one factor, frequency of communications was the second factor, And the most important by far was this factor. I didn't want to put everything on the slide or be too crowded. There are actually 7 things on each side of the matrix. So they range from no control at all to veto power to issues like where's the annual picnic to strategy. And as you move towards the bottom right-hand quadrant of that matrix, your score goes up, of course. And the more you were in that bottom right-hand quadrant, the higher your measure on degree of involvement. It's a fairly simple measure, and we did this with both management and employees. Interesting outcome, no matter what the management score was and what the employee score was, management score was always almost a point higher than employee score in the most participative companies and the least ones. So management always thinks that employees are more involved than employees think they are. So that's what we found, is that those 3 factors. And since then, we've basically been repeating that story over and over again. Scott Roderick, who's our publications editor, tells me that I really only have written 1 article on employee stock ownership plans in 38 years. And what I do is I just keep adding to it or amending it for this purpose or that purpose. And basically, what we did with our research is sort of the same thing. We found this core concept, and every study we did subsequently to that, and I think it's pretty fair to say just about every study anybody else did subsequent to that, has borne out that central concept. And I think that's been really important. So we define that now as an ownership culture, and it has these 4 elements. Meaningful amounts of ownership in terms of percentage of pay. This is kind of the baseline. If you're giving people 1% of pay and you expect that to change their behavior, you're in la-la land. But that's just the start. The second is that if you're going to treat employees like owners, they need information about what ownership means on a day-to-day basis in terms of the metrics that they're using to make decisions. Jack Stack from The Great Game of Business has a great analogy. If you're playing a basketball game and the coach says, only I get to know the score, that's not going to be real motivational. I mean, you wouldn't want to play at all if only the coach knew the score. But it goes farther than that because there's all these other metrics of how well the team is doing and how well you're doing and so on that make it a lot more interesting and that allow you to make adjustments to how you're playing the game. And the same thing is true in business, that being able to see all these numbers, not just the income statement and the balance sheet, but the numbers at the work level, the key performance indicators of what you're doing. So for instance, a company whose board I was on, the employees are mostly salespeople. And they set up a system where every employee on a real-time basis could see the impact of a change in fixed price contracts that they were selling on the profitability of that contract. Once they instituted that system and set up an incentive compensation system based on the profitability of the contract, within 1 year, with the same sales, their profits tripled because the salespeople are paying a lot more attention to how these changes affected profitability and whether they were really necessary or not. But that was just the beginning because they took the next step. They obviously talked a lot about the plan, but they said, now that you've got all this information, what are you going to do with it besides change your contracts? Are there other things you can do? And the salespeople started asking the customers Is there something else we can do for you? That maybe it's not what our core business is. And so in this company, which provided chemical treatment for industrial boiler pipes and things like that so they didn't corrode, a lot of them are hospitals, and they said, we need to test for Legionnaire's disease. Can you do that? Well, they'd never done it before, but they thought, well, we'll go see now. Before, they wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have asked, and they wouldn't have cared. But now they thought, well, maybe, because it wasn't that much more to them whether they would do these tests. But it could mean a lot to the company overall. So they went back to their technical people and they said, can we do this? And they said, I think we can figure out a way to not only test for it, but a better way to treat the water so it doesn't become a problem. And within 3 years, that business grew to $5 million, which was about 25% of their gross and about half their profit. And they can grow that business as fast as they want. Management never was involved in that decision other than to say, good work, great, go do it. And so that's what an ownership culture looks like. And that's why it can be so powerful. So these are some examples of what goes on in these cultures. I'll go through these fairly quickly. So sharing the income statement is a great thing to do. It's symbolic, tells people the score, but it doesn't really tell them the specifics of what they can do to make changes. So these are critical numbers, so that's the sort of thing that I was talking about in that company, where each area of the company's operations has defining metrics about what makes it successful, and those are shared and the employees could then act on those. And then once they have that information, then what do they do with it? So how do you create effective processes within a company? And these are mostly teams and work groups and ad hoc committees that empower employees to take the information and make decisions to make the company more successful. And for most companies, the way you do this is open book management. And open book management is universal. I'm sorry, not open book, open door management. I've asked over the years, business owners, how many of you have closed door policies? And I think I found 3 so far. So every company on earth has an open door policy, but that tells you how useful it is. Because that's employee involvement by permission and encouragement. It's ambiguous. I don't know when to walk in the door. I don't know if I'll be listened to. I don't know if I can express my ideas in a way that will be convincing. I don't know if the boss will take credit for the idea I've just given, or the boss will say, I'll get back to you later, or we did that before. So all of those things militate against people walking through open doors. It's virtually useless. No matter how much you encourage it, you really need to go beyond permission to structuring. And this, here we've got the boss who's really trying to exhortatively create employee involvement by encouraging people. So you really need to get people involved in coming up with new ideas. But even more important, you need to get people involved in identifying problems. And too often we hear companies say, we're looking for solutions from employees. If all you can do is identify a problem, but you don't know the solution, don't bother me. So if I smell the gas leaking, I shouldn't tell anybody unless I know how to turn it off. And that's what happens in a lot of companies. Putting it in that kind of example makes it sound silly, but if you've been in a real company, you know it's not silly at all. That goes on all the time. So you need to structure collaboration. You need to find ways when employees can have structured, regular opportunities to sit down with critical information and make informed decisions about how you can do the projects you're doing, not just more efficiently, but also more effectively, and also how to create new customers and new business opportunities. And that's what the best companies do. So those are some examples of what we identify, and all kinds of different teams. And I think by now all of you are well aware of why this matters. We were talking at lunch about another factor here, which is speed. In most companies today, a lot of decisions are driven by technology. And that's whether you're cleaning people's buildings or you're installing the software for those buildings. There's tremendous amounts of data that need to be looked at and analyzed. And a lot of decisions need to be made a lot faster. Hierarchical systems are vastly too slow and inefficient to do that. Dispersed authority does that faster and better. So then the question was whether this mattered, and this research now gets into things you're no doubt very familiar with. Michael Quarry and I looked at these data from the original survey, and we looked at whether those companies performed better relative to their peers after the ESOP than they did relative to their peers before the ESOP. So we were measuring the incremental change in quasi-experimental design, and that's what we found. And boy, was that a lot of work then, because you had to actually go to Dun & Bradstreet books and look up the data. It wasn't something you could do by computer. And that got published in the Harvard Business Review. And I think that was, for the employee ownership community, a pretty important moment, because it really, I think, was a linchpin within this community of companies starting to move in this direction, because it demonstrated it made more money. And then finally, the last piece of research that I've been much involved in is the question is, does it work for taxpayers? And I think there's lots of ways to answer that, but the most compelling was looking at data from the General Social Survey on layoffs and the impact on the unemployment insurance costs and foregone taxes. And the amount, $8 to $13 billion per year, is several times the tax costs of ESOPs. There are other ways you could justify it, but that's good enough. That in itself pretty much takes care of things. So really all the rest has been commentary on that. And we now have 2 researchers on staff who do absolutely fabulous work. And you heard from Nancy this morning. And of course, the entire employee ownership research community has been doing research on all of this. I'm delighted that I don't have to do it anymore. You do it far better than I ever did. But it's been a lot of fun doing this, and it's been a lot of fun seeing how these ideas have gained traction over the years. So these are some of the other research things that we do as an organization. We have a huge employee ownership culture survey, governance surveys, executive compensation surveys, transaction surveys, litigation review. This is every ESOP lawsuit that's ever gone to court since 1990, categorized by the kind of lawsuit and tracks it through the appellate process. We have a major new analysis of DOL investigations coming out, and we have lots of lists of compilations of employee ownership. So, excuse me, one of the things that I'd be happy to talk to people more about is the ways in which data sources that we have might be of interest to you as researchers. And finally, some lessons learned. Ownership cultures works better. There's some, frankly, ideological preference that people bring to employee ownership, that they come in with sort of preconceived notions about what it should be. And I think you should try not to do that and look at what the data actually tell us and go from there. ESOP professionals in the early community had their preferences. They thought just communicating would get it done, and that's pretty much gone by the wayside. And finally, some exhortations. You know, there's an old joke about the drunk looking for his wallet under the lamppost, and somebody says, "Why are you looking there?" And he says, "Because that's where the light is." And academics can be kind of like that, where the choice of the research you do is because that's where the data are, not necessarily because those are the most interesting questions to ask. The most interesting questions to ask tend to involve more difficulty in actually creating the data that answers those difficult questions, but those questions are the ones that really need to be addressed. So I hope people will think about that. Worker co-ops are fascinating, but they're not probably scalable. And so while it's interesting to research them, I would argue maybe that there's an imbalance in how much research is going into those relative to other kinds of work. And that's not to disparage worker co-ops or research on that, but if you're making a decision about what to do, think about that. And there's still a vast number of practical issues in ESOPs that need addressing, and we'd love to see academics turn your attention to those things. And oops, that's it.
Eric.
Right. Oh, I need that as well. Get those slides up there. While those are coming up, I'm just going to say one little anecdote, which is that when I started this research on this, Corey mentioned that they have lists and so forth at NCEO, and one of the first things I did was I actually bought one of those lists. It was they maintain a list of majority employee-owned companies in the United States. And it came in the form of a spreadsheet, and I don't know how many entries are in that, maybe around 1,000, something. Oh,
At that time.
yeah, there was about 1,000 of them at that time, and and I opened it up, and one of the data points that was in there was when Corey had entered that into the list. And as I followed some of them down, some of them were, there was obviously they're from the 2000s, from the 90s. There were some from well into the 80s, early on in the 80s, and I thought, wow, he's been at this for a long time.
Right.
Then I also thought, he's actually probably been at this for longer. Like 85 might have been the first one, but that's probably when Corey got a PC and a spreadsheet program to write these down. So I think that he'd been at it for before that, and so that's my way of saying that I'm very humbled to be commenting on Corey's work, because he really is a giant in the field of this. And I think he greatly underestimates the impact of his own work, which he didn't really speak too much about, which I want to first comment on a little bit. And I want to say, we know that Louis Kelso is the person who created the ESOP and got it codified into law through whatever mechanisms he used to do that. But I also want to say that I think that Corey's efforts really rank alongside Kelso's in terms of the importance of the creation and the sustaining of this institution of the employee stock ownership plan. And for some of the reasons I could point to is, and I would say that I believe that ESOPs would exist today were it not for Corey and the NCEO, because I think for some period of time, well, as the founder, not only did he create it, but the people who have come after him in NCEO are there because Corey made the effort to put the NCO together. But I want to ask this question. So how many ESOPs would there be without the 1042 rollover? Right? As a legislator or as a legislative aide, Corey was responsible for getting that put into the IRS code. How much would we know today about ESOPs without Corey and the primary research that the NCO does? And I would actually say I think that we would know very little. You know, I oftentimes, as I'm doing ESOP research, people will ask me, well, what about the, tell me something about the ESOP. How many are there? Or, any kind of descriptive statistical information. The first thing I always say is, well, go to the NCO website and read what's there, because that is the place where we get information about the population of ESOP companies. And how much more difficult would it be for ESOP administrators to do their job if NCO didn't exist and do what it is that they do, as Corey mentioned, the tracking and providing information about legislation and court cases around ESOPs. As an ESOP administrator, these are fundamentally important issues that you need to be able to know. So I really want to just emphasize that I think that Corey is on par, of course, with Kelso as somebody, as we think about the creation and sustaining the development of ESOPs. And so I would say I'm tempted to say that everything we know about ESOPs we know because of Corey and the NCO. It's not strictly true, but it's not that far off either. So I just want to try to recognize that and the importance that that's had on my own ability to do the work that I want to do. So I want to talk now a little bit about research and the implications of Corey's work for the research. And what I want to say is we really need to take seriously, not just researchers, but also practitioners, what he emphasized there around this issue of an ownership culture and the effect that that has. We oftentimes see employee ownership treated as though it was a singular thing. And I want to emphasize that these are these points that he made in his presentation, meaningful amounts of ownership, sharing financials, which I interpreted as open book management, but I guess maybe I shouldn't have, but I think of it as open book management. Regular and effective communication, and as I quoted here, the day-to-day involvement in work-level decisions. Now, I know that some people in this room are going to be made nervous by at least that last bullet item there, which is data. Let me go back to that. Most critically, day-to-day involvement in work-level decisions. But I want to point out that that is not as radical as it might seem. It reminded me when I read it more of W. Edwards Deming than it did of Pierre Joseph Proudhon, which I think they oftentimes when people talk about participation in management, it's as though we're talking about a radical anarchist takeover of the enterprise, which I know some business owners are worried that that's what's going to happen after they have an ESOP. But I think what we're asking for here, or what Corey's pointing to here as a key element in this, is just some degree of better communication and meaningful participation in the enterprise in the running of the enterprise. But I want to, so again, I need to emphasize this idea that empirical work on employee ownership fundamentally needs to recognize that employee ownership is not a dichotomous variable, right? It's not a 1 or a 0. It's not on or off. It really depends on the degree and the way in which it's being implemented. We think of, there's oftentimes companies that are models, and we go, and I've gone and visited some ESOP companies in Kansas City, and just recently I was at Burns & McDonnell, which is an engineering firm there, a very successful, rapidly growing, long-time 100% ESOP company. They would be ranked very high on Corey's list of an ownership culture. When I went and met there, I met with their CFO, who was formerly, has been very active in their ESOP for a long period of time, but also the director of their communications committee, which was there, who was there to explain all of the ways in which they communicate and try to draw in their employees to make this thing effective. Right, so that's one of the things, the lesson I will always take from Corey's work. Employee ownership is not a singular dichotomous variable. And the other thing I want to point out is that failure to recognize the impacts of a culture of ownership really introduces this unobserved heterogeneity into the work that you're looking at. We're not looking at a heterogeneous population of firms. We're looking at firms that also differ, or I should say employee ownership that also differs along these different parameters in which Corey has told us to look to in terms of employee ownership. And if we forget that, we're making a mistake and we're introducing problems into the research that we're doing, because it's not a singular thing, employee ownership. It is a variety of things. It involves a variety of things, and if we're going to try to identify the effects of it, we need to identify the effects of the variety of things that Corey has indicated we should be looking for. So I want to point out that best practices research in the future should endeavor to identify ownership culture that Corey describes. That should be part of what we think about when we go to talk about empirical research on employee ownership companies. And we should also look skeptically on research that does not. And I hate to say that, because I know that, as Corey mentioned, as academics, we're always looking where the light is, right? Because data gathering and data analysis is a lot more, has a much bigger payoff as an academic than data gathering does. Data gathering is hard, difficult work to do, and oftentimes beyond the scope of what academics can do. And so this is really raising the bar. But if we really want to do useful and effective research along these lines, we need to push in that direction. And of course, it complicates our matters for thinking about this. But what he's pointed to is, at least now we know what's missing in the research, and what needs, or in that research that has not included this, and where it is that we need to be paying more attention as we go forward. And I think the way to honor Corey's contribution to the work that he's done is for the impact of this to be referenced in, or to be reflected in the research and the practice of the creation and organization of ESOPs within the United States. That if we believe in them, we need to believe in pushing for the kinds of things that Corey has said really matter and really make a difference. So, and that's it for me.
Thank you. So I'm going to echo a lot of what you just heard. Corey mentioned that he was lucky to have so many people come through the organization who were talented, and I want to push back on that and say it's not luck, and I know that from personal experience. It's Corey's passion for this idea combined with how compelling employee ownership is. Those two things brought people through the door. And you know, it wasn't the website when I was applying for the NCEO that drew me into this exciting, like, new idea that I hadn't heard of before. It was Corey sitting down with me and talking about how much he cared about this idea that brought me here, and that has you know, shifted, and many of you have since then, in bringing me into this community, have done the same in moving my career this way. But really, you were the gateway for me to enter this this field, and I'm forever grateful for that. So this is why we come to this, and I love that so much of what this time was on this presentation was telling the story, because so much of what Corey's body of work is building this field into a field, right? Is professionalizing it, is building community around it, is making these ideas accessible and available to anybody who is interested in learning about them. So telling your story about policy, about building the NCEO, as much as the research is a critical part of your body of work. And you know, in the cooperative community, there's a co-op Hall of Fame, and they call it, you know, they say, like, this is the highest honor that our field can bestow upon someone. And to some extent, Joseph, I think that you are, with some of these body of work presentations, creating a employee ownership Hall of Fame. And I don't think anybody in this room, anyone anywhere, would question that you are an early and incredibly important inductee into this Employee Ownership Hall of Fame that Joseph has put together here. So as for the research, I think, you know, some of what you hear when you're hearing about this ownership culture work, there's a little bit of a yeah, we know employee, it's really good to engage employees, but that yeah was what the foundation that NCEO and that Corey laid, is making it obvious that you should engage workers and and build an ownership culture was that work, right? That wasn't always obvious to everybody. And now when we hear this, we're like, oh yeah, that, that absolutely makes sense. But that foundation is what made that a part of who this community is worker engagement. So that research has been critical to just designing who we are as a community, figuring out through trial and error and through listing factors and through weeding them out that what really matters is people, right? And engaging them in this process. And but I'm going to have to push back as someone who is very deeply in the cooperative community. Yes, it is ideological, a lot of what we work on. And when the idea is democracy, it's important to be ideological. And when the idea is, I just don't think we should give up on economic democracy because of our numbers. We shouldn't give up on economic democracy because the trials and errors of what we've done hasn't panned out to huge, like millions of worker owners in the U.S. The idea behind this ideology is that every leader should be accountable to those who she leads. Every leader should be accountable. Not necessarily that we need to, have collective decision-making structures where we're doing everything together, but accountability is critical. And so we need to innovate and figure out the forms to make this make sense. And we need researchers and we need academics to be thinking radically about these ideas. We shouldn't back away from it just because we don't have the numbers. I do think that that's similar to looking where the light is. The ESOPs do have good data. It's and then the worker co-op community benefits from it because, when we're citing data, we're like, oh yeah, and worker-owned companies perform better. And that data that we're drawing from isn't worker co-op data typically. It's ESOP data that we're drawing from and just so we very much need that data. But I do think that it's worthwhile for us to still invest, despite the numbers, in looking at democratic forms of worker ownership. And I do want to just continue to acknowledge, we don't quite walk it like we talk it yet in the worker co-op field. We're talking a big game right now, and we're a small field. That's completely true. And we haven't figured it out yet. Even when we walk into the room with confidence, we haven't figured it out yet. But nobody has, because the economic inequality that is persisting and growing, the solutions that we have with ESOPs aren't all of them. That's not the entire solution. So I think there should not be an us and them in this field. We're all working towards this goal. We're all working towards economic inclusivity and employee ownership, worker ownership, whatever we want to call that umbrella. I think we need to really just be innovating together built off the foundation that we've built over the last 40 years in the employee ownership field. What have we learned from ESOPs that can make us do better with democratic structures? What have we learned that can make us scale? But yeah, just to end, I think that the challenges that we're facing right now in our economy, so many of the solutions live in what the foundation that you and others in this field have built so far, and we need to take those lessons and bring them forward to the new situations that we're facing right now. So thank you so much. I know we're not supposed to address people. I'm so bad at this academic conference thing. I know we're not supposed to address people directly. Eric always does such a good job, and we've been respondents together, and then I'm like, he did such a good job, and I messed it up again. But thank you. You've been incredible inspiration in my career, and thanks for sharing your body of work.
So we now have some brief commenters, and Daphne Barry is already with us at the table, but I'm going to ask actually Camille and Eric to make way for at least a couple. So we've got Barbara Baxa. Barbara, maybe you can take a seat. And Daphne, as I said, Barry is already here. Marianne Beister, you can sit here. we may have to ask Corey to move, I'm not sure. And then I will move as soon as I stop talking. So Michael Keeling and Lauren Rogers. And we've asked them each to speak for only a minute, which seems utterly impossible, but so we may go over just a little bit in our scheduling. So Barbara, would you like to start us off?
So when I first met Corey in 1998, I had no idea what ESOPs are. And I'll be honest, I still really only have a vague idea of what they are. When I met Corey in 1998, what he was doing is flying around the country to do a bunch of workshops on stock options. And I was asked to present at a few of those workshops. And Corey was doing those workshops because he believes that employee ownership can come in more forms than just ESOPs, and that it can include other types of ways of delivering stock to employees, including stock options and ESPPs and RSUs. Because Corey, if he's nothing else, he's a true believer in employee ownership. And so because of that, at that time, he was sort of diversifying the NCEO to cover not just ESOPs, but to cover, at that time it was just stock options, nobody was doing anything else. But now the NCEO covers all forms of equity, including not just stock options, but other types of stock awards and employee stock purchase plans. And Corey has really contributed pretty significantly to that field. I think most of you know him mainly for his work in ESOPs, but what I know him for is in the field of other types of stock compensation. And when he listed on the slide all those research studies that he's done on ESOPs, he's also participated in a lot of research studies on stock compensation and on the prevalence of stock compensation and how companies use it and how they design it. And those studies have been equally helpful to that community. And in addition to that, the NCO itself provides a lot of resources. And I know he said he only wrote one article on ESOPs, but I'm sure he's written a lot of articles on various types of stock awards because I've seen them published in all the books. Okay, sorry, I gotta go fast. All the books that the NCEO publishes on stock compensation. And that whole set of books has become a curriculum that is now used in an exam for people who want to be qualified to administer stock compensation plans. So they've been a true contribution to this community. And the last thing I just want to say is I served briefly on the board of the NCEO, and in addition to being a believer in ownership, Corey really practices what he preaches. And the staff of the NCEO has been set up in a way that is very, NCEO employees are given a great deal of input around how the organization is run. Corey has always run that organization with a lot of transparency. Everyone who is on staff has had access to how the company is, the financials, and in many ways I think the staff has much more say over the organization than the board did. So.
Hi, I'm Daphne Berry, and in order not to repeat things people are saying, I'm going to talk about something that I think the rest won't talk about because I have a different kind of position, and that is, well, I started out in employee ownership with a worker cooperative, and so to learn about what the broader group of employee ownership was, of course, I went to the NCEO database, and you can read about intro and culture and all sorts of things, but what I'm doing right now that makes me happiest is bringing it into my classroom. And so I teach a management course, a junior level management course to students, and talking about organizational design and structure and organizational behavior and motivation and job satisfaction, and it's perfect to be able to tell students what these kinds of, what employee ownership is and use NCEO resources. And I can talk to them about a worker cooperative, and I can talk to them about an ESOP and publicly owned and privately owned and broad-based ownership. So I every semester, the last thing I do every semester is give my students an extra credit assignment, and they have to go to the NCEO website and pick out an employee-owned company, anything they want, and talk about it. What is it? What are they doing? Do they talk about employee ownership? And all kinds of things. And so every student that comes by me leaves knowing a little bit about employee ownership, and so that makes me really happy. And that's because of the NCO database and website. Absolutely. Okay.
Okay, so I'm Mary Ann Beister, and I'm really excited that this afternoon we're celebrating this body of research by Corey Rosen. And this is the largest, as this is the largest gathering of scholars in employee ownership, I just think it's such a fitting place to understand and recognize the dedication that Corey has had for advancing employee ownership research for decades. But I'd also like us to celebrate his entrepreneurial spirit. And if it wasn't for that entrepreneurial spirit, we wouldn't have the National Center for Employee Ownership. And because we have the because we have NCEO, there's an avenue for objective and reliable information to be translated from research into practice. And the NCO has not only proven to be a partner in contributing to that research, but in advancing the distribution of that information. As founder and CEO of the NCO, Corey took entrepreneurial risk in 1981. There were no other organizations like this in the field. And he also helped other organizations. He supported my late father, Bob Beister, and looking at what the foundation and later the Institute would do. And he's helped many others in creating employee ownership support services. So I'll wrap by saying Corey is to be commended for the research that he's done, but also for advancing the body of research that others are doing. And finally, for being entrepreneurial and building the bridges to translate research to have impact in practice.
I will be brief. I want to add a little bit to the discussion about what Corey said, because if you listen to Corey carefully, you read between the lines something that I think is very, very important for everyone in this room to understand. There is no perfection. There is no perfection. And those in our universe and our Congress and our decision makers and academia and think tanks that feel that XYZ should be mandated and that will make perfection, they didn't listen to what Corey said very well. Corey knows employee ownership. He's done a wonderful job of explaining it, and he made it clear to get where you want to go, where we all want to go. You do not do things written out word for word and do it that way. I've been in over 575 companies. I've seen the bad, good, and the ugly, and the excellent. Every company has its own culture. The big picture things Corey said, remember them. He's got the data that what he said is correct.
So I'm Lauren Rogers. Some people would say I am filling Corey's shoes. I don't quite feel that way. But one thing I wanted to point out is we're calling this a body of work, which makes it sound a little bit like he's not going to keep adding to it. And I see him every week. We work together all the time. And I think it's appropriate to end with just a little bit of teasing Corey, because he mentioned his typos. But I wanted to mention an example in particular, which was just on Friday. We got a document which said that ESOP participants can be either receive their distributions in cash or in sock. And I figured in sock, that doesn't make sense. I mean, is it in a sock or is it in socks? So what I did want to say, though, about Corey is that in my mind, what Corey has contributed to the field is that his role as being a diverse thinker, an omnivorous reader, which comes through in all of his conversations. He's a truth teller and a good listener. And I thought what Eric said about some of his observations making people squirm is right on. Anybody here who has had a conversation with Corey, I'm willing to bet that it's had you either thinking, squirming, laughing, blushing, or nodding. it's hard to leave a conversation with Corey without having your perspective on whatever it is you just spoke about changed. And if the future of this world has a significant amount of employee ownership in it, I think it's because of Corey Rosen. I think it's because of his role in building the support for this community, the intellectual, the evidential, the communications, and the community.
So I'm Joseph Blasi. I'm not on the program. I'm taking organizers' prerogative to say a few things. Corey ranks as the giant in research that we honor today. He shows that important research takes place outside of academia, and a lot of subsequent work has confirmed the initial early findings of his studies. He shows that carefully designed studies, just a few, can have a huge impact. I wouldn't be true to my long relationship and friendship with Corey if I didn't take him to the woodshed today. I'm firmly convinced that his comments on worker cooperatives are false, and that if worker cooperatives could use credit, conversion of existing successful companies, and choose the right industry groups, they would rapidly look like ESOPs. I want to end with two observations on Corey's personality, his steadfastness, his integrity. Those of us who have close relationships with him see them as the most precious relationships we have. I think we should all stand up and celebrate his career. No.
Thank you all. That's really embarrassing. Thanks anyway.